Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Dale Sandeen about This Cursed House. Welcome, Dale.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everybody.
What a wonderful book this is. It's billed as Southern Gothic and a horror novel. So what attracted you to Southern Gothic?
Well, I have lived in the South almost my entire life, and I think I've always had a preference for darker stories, and Southern Gothic, fits in there very well. And some of my, I love, even though Toni Morrison does not, a couple of her stories have been based in the South, but I've always loved Toni Morrison, just her language, the way she writes. I also always loved Alice Walker and some of the newer, Southern Gothic authors that I really enjoy include Jesmyn Ward, Eden Royce. And it's just, I think it's something about the South. And I know that maybe for Black people in particular, with the history of the South, like it can be painful, but at the same time, I still feel like, this is my home. This is where my family is. This is where my family has been. So I have I have a love for it, but, I also realize, I'm also familiar with the history of it. So, there's good and there's bad.
In all of us, it doesn't matter our skin tone. There is good and bad. That's always been a big influence of mine, having grown up in Eastern North Carolina. If you go around with your eyes open and not behind a blindfold, you really do see that all of humanity has good and bad. Each human being has the potential for good and bad inside of us. And we are really aware of how life has shaped in the South, good and bad in history. And I think it's cathartic when we read and write about it, because it gives us a chance to have our voice heard.
Exactly.
So, and the book starts off in one of my favorite cities in this country, which is Chicago. Mm-hmm. And our main character goes from Chicago and she gets a job outside of New Orleans. So will you give the audience a setup of what This Cursed House is about?
Yes. So the book is set in the early 1960s, and my protagonist, Gemma Barker, she's moving from Chicago to New Orleans. She's accepted a job offer from a family. Gemma has always been able to see spirits, but she's never accepted that as a gift. She kind of views it more as a curse, and she's always repressed that ability. And she leaves Chicago. She's got several reasons for wanting to leave Chicago. So she's happy to get this job offer, and she's looking at it as a fresh start. So because Gemma can see spirits, New Orleans is probably not the place you want to go if you're trying to escape spirits, but she ends up there. And her ability is actually it's crucial to the story and the plot and solving the dilemma, that the family has.
That's a wonderful setup for it. And I will say that your use of language is so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
When Gemma arrives in New Orleans on the train and she exits the train, she's in an outfit that's not appropriate for the swamp of New Orleans. And just your descriptions of that it was so magical, because I have been to New Orleans many times, and I've been there on that first weekend in September where everything on your body, including your toenails, has the ability to sweat.
Right. I know.
You being from Florida, you get plenty of it as well. But honestly,
yes.
in the swamp of New Orleans, it is something that will take your breath away.
Definitely. And I know someone who's from Chicago, and he said when he first came to Florida, he said that humidity was, he knew about the heat, but the humidity he just was not prepared for. So, yeah.
It makes my skin look fabulous. That's a really
it
great
does.
thing about it. any impurities definitely come out. So
Right.
so do you, as Dell, are you a ghost believer or a spirit believer?
Okay, I've never seen a ghost and I could go the whole rest of my life without ever seeing one. I'd be fine with that. But I do believe in them mainly because I've talked to a couple of people, people who I trust, and know very well. And they told me about some experiences that they had. And I had no reason to not believe them, or not distrust them. And I think because also I feel like, as people, we're, as human beings, we have one form, but I don't think that it's outside the realm of possibility that we can have other forms, particularly after we die. So, yes, I believe in ghosts. No, I don't ever want to see one.
I think that's a perfect answer, and may your wish come true. So,
Thank you.
because I feel exactly the same way you do. I have always been cognizant that we have a spirit within ourselves, and I don't think it just dissipates when we pass on. I think that
Mhm.
the spirits take on different forms. I've seen more than one psychic or medium in my life, and I find them to be so credible because I think they find an ability to tap into something. And just
Mhm.
as Gemma is a little worried that it might be a curse, if you fix your mind up, it could be a great blessing as well.
Exactly.
And I love that. And so there's a lot of entrapment in your book. Would you speak a little bit about what you wanted to get out in the world with that? Do you feel that there was a bit of entrapment in your book?
Definitely. And not just with the Duchon family. I also feel like Gemma was trapped in a way. And I think sometimes because, okay, it's a horror story, but it's also a story about family and forgiveness and acceptance. And I think until Gemma was able to free herself, of a lot of her fears and a lot of her insecurities, she was kind of trapped. Even though she could freely, come and go, she was definitely trapped. I feel like the Duchons were trapped in their way of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
well as, other ways they were trapped. But yes, I think when people, well, when characters, well, this happens in real life too, but when we're just so much inside ourselves, not able to have a different perspective on things, yes, we can definitely stay trapped or, just end up stuck in a place. So, yes.
I agree, and I think you did that so masterfully. I mean, we saw the Dushan family, we saw Gemma, we saw the dead, we saw people who were trapped in their moment. May I say, just and for some of them, that moment had been a very long time. So
Hmm.
so I love the fact that this takes place in 62 and 63. 63 holds a special place in my heart because that's the day I debuted, or the year I
Oh,
debuted.
okay.
So
Okay.
I, of course, loved that. I loved also the fact that you showed us New Orleans at a time where it was segregated.
Mhm.
And I know how far the Treme is from the train station. So I'm like, and Gemma has a journey to go on. And a lot of her journey seems a long distance, not just from Chicago to New Orleans, but from the train station to the Treme. And then also in her mind, she has a long journey. Um,
Right.
why choose 62 and 63? Was there something particular, or was it just a great setting, which it was?
Okay. When I first, got the idea to write this cursed house, I wasn't sure about the time. I set on New Orleans pretty early on, but I did at one point consider setting it in the present day. Part of the reason that I did choose the early 60s is because anybody who knows me knows that one of my favorite films is Eve's Bayou, and it also takes place in Louisiana in the early 60s. So that was one reason. Also, the colorism, aspect that's a big theme of the book. Even though colorism does still exist, I think if the book was set today, there would be more pushback against it. But back then, there wasn't too much. There was not a lot of pushback. So that was just another obstacle that Gemma was going to have to face.
And the Duchamp family could pass, which was a big word in, I would say, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in the fact that they were very fair skinned.
Mhm.
What drew you to setting them as those characters?
Well, them being, so fair that they could pass as white, that, plays a big part in the story, not just in how they treat Gemma, but also it's like a generational trauma, theme, because, as you get into the story, you find out not just why, they're the color that they are, but the lengths that they've gone to, to keep their family, looking this way. And to touch on what we discussed before about being trapped, that was, the Duchamps wanting to stay, looking this way, and the things that they did, to keep their family looking a certain way. That was, definitely one of the things that kept them trapped.
And I,
Um, Oh, go ahead, Dan.
sorry. No, I think that, when we cling on to antiquated ideas, the ones, especially the ones we create in our own mind, I think
Hmm.
that keeps us trapped as human beings. And you
Definitely.
mentioned a phrase that I was really struck by, and I'm glad you mentioned it, which is generational trauma. Studies have said that generational trauma is passed down at least 3 generations, if not longer. And I look at that period of time in New Orleans, and then, how New Orleans progressed over the years in the 70s and 80s. And you see that generational trauma still being played out, even probably as late as the 90s and maybe into today's world as well.
Right, right, definitely. Yeah.
But also, you give us hope, which is always what a reader wants. Gemma isn't just on her journey all alone. She's her best friend, Madeline, is just
Magdalene.
Magdalene. See, I knew I
Yes.
was going to screw up at least one name. We
That's
talked about this
okay.
before recording.
That's okay.
I mean, I wouldn't be human without it. So, but
No worries.
I love her friend, and there's a little passage when they break through a wall, and Gemma says she pulled her friend in with her, and I was like, "Oh, I bet you did." Now all of a sudden, you needed some help.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in there by myself either. So yeah.
Me either. Me either. I love it. So, how much how much fun was writing this book?
um, it was pretty fun. I know some of the themes are heavy, but I always tell people I think the most fun part for me was writing some of the nastier characters, like Simone, because I think when it comes to just mean, mean characters, they can do or say pretty much anything,
Yep.
and it's just very unexpected. So that was fun. Because am I ever going to say some of the things like that in real life? I doubt it. But even the exchange between Magdalene and Honorine at the Mardi Gras parade, that very brief exchange, that was a lot of fun because it was like, well, somebody is finally telling Honorine what she thinks about her, and she deserves it. So yeah, in spite of some of the heavy themes, it was a pretty fun book to write.
Oh, I'm glad to know that. And I like the heavy scenes because it gives it an authenticity to it. I mean,
Mhm.
we could you could have easily have sugarcoated half of the book, and it wouldn't be nearly as fun as it is because as a read, because we do need to look at real life, and we need to look at these heavy situations. And I think when we're talking about both life and death, heavy situations are around both living and dead.
Right, definitely.
So, do you have a social media or a website you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes, my website is www.delsandeen.com, and I'm only active on Twitter. You can find me there at Delsandeen.
Fantastic. Again, the book is called This Cursed House. It's out October 8th. Congratulations, and I hope you the best of success. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at outwithdan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.